The Volanthi hegemony had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never met a species they could not crush beneath their claws. They were ancient beings with shells of dark purple chitin and eyes that saw in spectrums. Humans could not imagine, and they believed themselves to be the rightful masters of the galaxy. When their scouts first discovered humanity 3 centuries ago, they had laughed at what they found. Here was a species barely crawling out of their home system with primitive fusion drives and clumsy metal ships and weapons that seemed like toys compared to Volanthi plasma cannons. The hegemony had watched humanity spread to 42 colony worlds along the galactic rim, and they had not been concerned. These humans were farmers and miners and builders, and they posed no threat to an empire that spanned 1,000 systems. Meridian 7 was the 23rd human colony, and it was a world of golden wheat fields and blue oceans, and small towns where children played in the streets without fear. The population was 2.3 million souls, and most of them had never seen a weapon more dangerous than a hunting rifle. Governor Sarah Chun had been born on Meridian 7, and she loved her world with every fiber of her being, and she had spent 20 years making it a place where families could thrive. The orbital defense station above the planet was old and understaffed, and its pulse cannons had not been fired in decades. Commander James Webb ran the station with a crew of 50, and he spent most of his days filing reports and watching cargo ships come and go. On the morning that changed everything, Commander Webb was drinking coffee and reviewing supply manifests when his sensor officer screamed. The man was pointing at his screen with shaking hands, and Webb walked over to see what had frightened him so badly. The display showed 17 massive signatures emerging from slipspace, and Webb felt his heart stop as he recognized the configuration Volanthi dreadnoughts. Behind them came 40 cruisers, and then 200 smaller vessels, and the fleet spread across the sky like a dark stained web. Slammed his hand on the emergency beacon and sent a distress signal screaming toward Earth at faster than light speeds. He knew it would take 14 minutes to arrive, and he knew that he and his crew would be dead long before any help could come. But someone had to know what happened here. Admiral Keth Varn stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the tiny human station on his view screen with something like contempt. He had commanded fleets for 300 years, and he had burned worlds that were far more impressive than this. The Vedic rock, the humans had built a colony in a system that the hegemony had marked for future expansion, and that was all the justification he needed. There would be no warnings, and no demands, and no negotiations. The Volanthi did not negotiate. With insects, Kethvorin raised one clawed hand and gave the order to fire. The orbital station vanished in a bloom of plasma fire, and Commander Webb and his 50 crew members died without ever knowing what had hit them on the surface below. Governor Chen was in her office when the sky turned white. She ran to the window and saw streaks of fire falling from the heavens, and she understood immediately what was happening. The emergency sirens began to wail across every city and town on Meridian 7, and people ran for the underground bunkers that had been built for natural disasters. But these bunkers had never been designed to withstand orbital bombardment. Chung grabbed her communicator and broadcast on every channel, begging people to run and hide and pray. She was still broadcasting when a plasma bolt struck the Capitol building and turned it into vapor. Across Meridian 7, the death rained down for 6 terrible hours. Plasma fire turned fertile farmland into sheets of glass and peaceful. Cities became burning craters, and the blue oceans boiled where the bombardment struck. Families huddled in bunkers that became ovens as the ground above them melted. Children ran through burning streets calling for parents they would never find. A mother named Elena Vasquez held her infant daughter close and whispered words of love as the fire consumed them both. When it was over, 2.1 million humans were dead. The survivors numbered fewer than 200,000, and most of them were burned and broken and wandering through the ashes of everything they had known. Admiral Kethvorin reviewed the damage reports with satisfaction, and filed his official record with cold efficiency. He wrote that the territorial incursion had been resolved and the indigenous settlement had been neutralized with minimal resource expenditure. He recommended that the hegemony proceed with colonization of the system within the next decade. Then he ordered his fleet to return to Volanthi space, and he never gave Meridian 7 another thought. He did not know that the distress signal had reached Earth. He did not know that every human ship in the galaxy had received Commander Webb's final transmission. He did not know that the footage from the surface had been captured by personal devices and emergency cameras and was now spreading across human space like wildfire. He did not understand what he had awakened on Earth. A young girl named Maya Chun watched the footage of her grandmother's world burning, and she felt something cold and hard settle into her heart. Across the colonies, millions of humans watched the same images and felt the same terrible transformation. They saw Elena Vasquez holding her baby as the fire took them. They saw children running and screaming through streets of flame. They saw 2 million of their brothers and sisters murdered without warning or mercy or reason. And something changed in humanity that day. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened its eyes and looked upon what had been done to its children. The Volanthi hegemony had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. They had crushed every species that had ever challenged them. They had never known fear, but they were about to learn. The news reached Earth in waves like a tsunami, building strength as it approached the shore. First, the military channels received Commander Webb's distress signal, and admirals and generals watched with pale faces as the data scrolled across their screens. Then the civilian networks picked up the story, and within hours every human being from Sol to the frontier colonies knew what had happened on Meridian 7. The United Terran Assembly was the governing body of all human space, and its representatives gathered in the Great Chamber in Geneva with grief and rage burning in their hearts. They came from Earth and Mars and the Moon colonies and the distant worlds along the rim, and they sat in silence as the footage played on the massive screens. Above them, the images were worse than anyone had imagined. Emergency cameras had captured the plasma bolts falling from the sky. Like the wrath of angry gods, personal devices had recorded the final moments of families huddled together in bunkers that offered no protection. A father's last message to his daughter on another world played across the chamber, and grown men and women wept openly as they listened to his words of love, and full well Governor Sarah Chun's final broadcast echoed through the hall as she begged her people to find shelter moments before her own death. And then there was Elena Vasquez holding her infant daughter and whispering that everything would be all right as the fire consumed them both. When the footage ended, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then a sound began to build from the representatives, and it was not weeping anymore. It was something older and darker and more dangerous. Fleet Admiral Chen Weilin stood and walked to the central podium, and every eye in the chamber turned to her. She was 63 years old, and she had commanded the Terran Navy for 15 years, and she had seen humanity through border skirmishes and pirate raids and diplomatic crises. But she had never requested full military mobilization. Until now, her voice was steady as stone when she spoke. The Volanthi hegemony believes that we are weak, and they believe that we will protest and negotiate and perhaps file a formal complaint with the Galactic Council, and they expect us to behave as every other young species has behaved when faced with their power. She paused and looked across the assembled representatives. They expect fear, and they expect submission, and they expect us to accept the murder of 2 million of our people as the price of survival in a hostile galaxy. Her hands gripped the podium and her knuckles went white. They are wrong. She touched the control, and the holographic display appeared, showing the full strength of the Terran Navy. We have 347 combat vessels in active service, and we have another 200 in reserve. And we have the industrial capacity to build more. The display shifted to show something else, and several representatives gasped. "And we have assets that no one knows about, and weapons that have never been tested, and ships that do not officially exist." Admiral Chun's eyes were hard as diamonds. The Volanthi believe they destroyed a defenseless farming colony, and they believe there will be no consequences, and they believe that humanity is just another primitive species to be crushed beneath their claws. Her voice dropped to something cold and terrible. They are about to learn that humanity does not forgive, and humanity does not forget, and humanity does not surrender. She looked at the representatives one by one. "I am requesting full military mobilization and a formal declaration of war against the Volanthi hegemony and authorization to use whatever means necessary to make them pay for what they have done." The vote was called immediately. It was unanimous. Across human space, the transformation began that very hour. Civilian shipyards received emergency orders to convert to military production, and workers who had spent their lives building cargo vessels began constructing warships instead. Reserve fleets that had been mothballed for decades were reactivated, and old ships were pulled from storage and refitted with new weapons and new engines. Veterans who had retired years ago received messages on their personal devices, and they reported to recruitment centers without being asked. Young people who had never considered military service lined up by the thousands to volunteer. On Mars, the great foundries that produce mining equipment began forging armor plating and railgun ammunition. On Luna, the research facilities that studied theoretical physics shifted their focus to weapons development. On Earth, the factories that built consumer goods converted overnight to produce military supplies. And in the deep black, far from any inhabited system, something stirred in the Darkness Project. Nemesis had been classified at the highest levels for 30 years, and fewer than 100 people in all of human space knew it existed. It was humanity's insurance policy against a hostile universe, and it had been built in secret by workers who never knew the full scope of what they were creating. Now the orders came. To wake it up, Commander Sarah Webb was the daughter of James Webb, who had died on the orbital station above Meridian 7, and she had been given command of a fast attack squadron. She gathered her crews and looked at the faces of men and women who had lost friends and family and loved ones in the burning. "They think we are weak because we chose peace," she told them. "They are about to learn that we chose peace because we knew what we were capable of in war." Her crews cheered, and the sound was not joy, but something fiercer and more primal across the colonies. Similar scenes played out as humanity prepared for a war it had never wanted, but would never shy away from. The Volanthi had 12,000 years of conquest behind them. Humanity had something more dangerous. Humanity had rage, and humanity had patience, and humanity had a very long memory. Admiral Kethvoran received reports that the humans were mobilizing, and he dismissed them with a wave of his claw. Let them mobilize, he thought. Let them build their little ships and train their little soldiers. The hegemony had crushed species far more advanced than these primitives. The humans would learn their place soon. Enough. He could not have been more wrong. The Volanthi hegemony received no declaration of war and no diplomatic communication, and no threats or demands. There was only silence from human space for 6 long weeks, and Admiral Kethvoran began to wonder if the primitives had simply accepted their fate. Perhaps they were smarter than he had thought. Perhaps they understood that resistance against the hegemony was futile. He was still entertaining these pleasant thoughts when the first human ships appeared in Volanthi space. The border fortress of Kethmarak had guarded the approaches to the hegemony for 3,000 years, and it was considered absolutely impregnable. The station was massive and bristling with plasma cannons and missile batteries, and it had shields that could withstand bombardment for days. A permanent garrison fleet of 30 warships patrolled the surrounding space, and they were veterans of a dozen campaigns against lesser species. Kethmarak had broken armadas, and it had never fallen, and its commanders had grown comfortable in their certainty of victory when the sensor officer reported 12 human vessels emerging from slipspace. The commander of the fortress actually laughed. 12 ships against Kethmarak. These humans were even more foolish than the hegemony had believed. The commander ordered his fleet to engage, and he settled back in his chair to watch the entertainment. He expected the battle to last perhaps 20 minutes. He was wrong. The lead human ship was designated TNS Retribution, and it was a heavy cruiser built in the shipyards of Mars, and it carried weapons the Volanti had never seen before. Railguns were not a new technology, but humans had refined them to a degree that bordered on the impossible tungsten slugs. The size of small vehicles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, and they crossed the distance between the fleets in the blink of an eye. The first Volanti cruiser took 3 slugs through its midsection, and it broke apart like a toy. The second cruiser tried to raise shields, but the rounds punched through the energy barriers as if they did not exist. The third cruiser managed to fire a single plasma volley before it was torn to pieces. The commander of Kethmarak stopped laughing. He had never seen ships move like the human vessels moved. They did not form neat battle lines like civilized species. They did not maintain proper formations or follow predictable attack patterns. They swarmed and scattered and attacked from angles that seemed suicidal, and somehow they always survived. The human pilots flew as if they did not care whether they lived or died, and perhaps they did not. Commander Sarah Webb sat in the captain's chair of the TNS Fury, and she watched her targeting display with cold, focused eyes. Her father had died above Meridian 7, and she had promised herself that she would make the Volanti pay for every human life they had taken. Target the lead dreadnought, she ordered. All batteries fire. The Furies. Railguns spoke, and the Volanti dreadnought shuddered as rounds tore through its hull. Plasma fire erupted from the enemy vessel, but the Fury was already moving, and the bolts passed through empty space. Human ships were smaller than their Volanti counterparts, but they were faster and more maneuverable, and their crews had trained for years in combat simulators that pushed them to their limits. The Volanti had relied on their superior numbers and firepower for so long that they had forgotten how to fight against an enemy that would not stand still and die. In 40 minutes, the garrison fleet was debris. 30 Volanti warships reduced to expanding clouds of wreckage and frozen bodies. The humans had lost 2 vessels, and they did not stop to mourn. The fortress of Kethmarak still stood, but its shields were weakening under the concentrated fire of the human squadron. Inside the station, the commander was screaming orders that no one could follow, and his crew was dying around him as hull breaches spread through the structure. A human boarding team breached the main airlock, and they moved through the corridors with brutal efficiency. These were not soldiers in the way the Volanti understood soldiers. These were predators, and they had come to hunt. The commander died at his post with a human rifle round through his skull, and he never understood how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. 3 hours after the battle began, the fortress of Kethmarak was silent. The humans did not occupy the station, and they did not plunder it or take prisoners. They simply placed demolition charges throughout the structure and withdrew to their ships. Commander Webb watched from the bridge of the Fury as the fortress exploded. In a bloom of fire and debris, "Signal the fleet," she said. "We are moving to the next target." She did not feel satisfaction or joy. She felt only the cold certainty that this was just the beginning. Admiral Kethvar received the report with the first stirrings of genuine unease. He had destroyed a defenseless farming colony, and in response, the humans had annihilated one of the hegemony's strongest border positions. This was not how inferior species were supposed to behave. He ordered 3 additional fleets to the human frontier, and he began to review everything the hegemony knew about these strange and violent creatures. The information was sparse, because no one had considered humanity worth studying in detail. That was beginning to seem like a serious mistake. Across the hegemony, other commanders received word of the disaster at Kethmarak, and they began to wonder if perhaps the humans were more dangerous than anyone had realized. But it was too late for wondering. War had begun, and humanity was coming, and humanity was angry. Within 3 months, the war had spread across 4 sectors of the galaxy and the Volanti. Hegemony was learning lessons it had never expected to learn. They had numbers on their side with thousands of warships and dozens of subject species pressed into service and industrial capacity that had been built over 12,000 years. By every calculation, they should have crushed humanity through sheer weight of forces. But humanity did not fight the kind of war the Volanti understood human. Strike groups appeared without warning in locations that Volanti strategists had calculated as impossible to reach. They emerged from slipspace behind defensive lines and struck at supply convoys and fuel depots and communication relays. They targeted admirals in their flagship quarters and planetary governors in their fortified bunkers. They made the hegemony feel fear for the first time in 8,000 years. Admiral Kethvorin stood in his war room and stared at the holographic map of his crumbling empire. Red markers showed human attacks, and they were everywhere. A supply fleet destroyed in the Korath system, a shipyard sabotaged in the Velthora sector, a communications hub reduced to rubble in the outer colonies. The humans seemed to be everywhere at once and nowhere when his fleets arrived to stop them. How are they doing this? He demanded of his intelligence officers. No one had an answer. The truth was that humans fought differently than any species Hegemony had ever encountered. Volanti commanders followed careful plans and maintained proper formations and engaged enemies. According to established doctrine, humans improvised and adapted and did things that seemed insane until they worked. A human captain named Marcus Stone became famous throughout both fleets for a maneuver that should have been impossible. His destroyer was outnumbered 5-1, and his engines were damaged, and by all logic, he should have surrendered or fled. Instead, he accelerated directly toward the enemy flagship and his crew. Prepared for death, the Volanti commander hesitated for just a moment because no sane being would ram a vessel 10 times their size. That hesitation cost him everything. Stone's destroyer struck the flagship amidships, and the resulting explosion destroyed both vessels, along with 3 cruisers caught in the blast radius. The humans called this tactic ramming, and they spoke of it with pride. Captured human soldiers did not break under interrogation no matter what methods the Volanti employed. They smiled at their captors and made promises about what would happen to their families. And then human special forces would appear from nowhere, and those promises would be kept. On the colony world of Velthoris, a single human operative infiltrated the capital city and sabotaged the atmospheric processors. 3 million Volanti suffocated over the next 12 hours as the air turned toxic. The operative escaped and was never caught. The hegemony had never faced an enemy capable of such cold and calculated revenge. They began to understand that humans did not just want to win the war. Humans wanted to make them suffer. Lieutenant Maya Chun had grown up on Earth watching footage of her grandmother's world burning. Governor Sarah Chun of Meridian 7 had been her father's mother, and Maya had spent summers on that beautiful world as a child. Now she commanded a fighter squadron, and she had painted the names of every person she had lost on the nose of her ship. There were 47 names. She added more after every battle, because the war took friends and comrades along with enemies. But she never considered stopping, and she never considered mercy. The Volanti had burned children alive, and Maya intended to make them pay for every single one at the Battle of the Korath Nebula. The human fleet engaged a Volanti armada twice its size. The fighting lasted for 18 hours, and the nebula glowed with plasma fire and exploding ships. When it was over, the Volanti had lost 60% of their forces, and the humans had lost 40% of theirs. By normal standards, it was a human victory, but the cost was terrible. Admiral Chun Weilin reviewed the casualty reports and felt the weight of every name. She had sent these men and women to die, and she would send more before the war was over. But she would not stop, and she would not negotiate, and she would not accept anything less than total victory. The Volante had murdered 2 million innocent people, and they would answer for that crime. 6 months into the war, Admiral Cathvoran sent a message to the Galactic Council requesting mediation. He had expected a quick campaign to punish an inferior species, and instead he was watching his empire bleed. The Council's response was brief and cold. They wrote that the Volante hegemony had initiated hostilities without provocation, and that the humans had declined all diplomatic contact, and that the Council would not intervene. Cathvoran read the message 3 times before he understood what it meant. The galaxy was going to watch the hegemony fall, and no one would lift a claw to help. He called his surviving admirals together, and they discussed options that grew more desperate by the day. Some advocated for a massive offensive to crush the human homeworld. Others suggested retreat and consolidation. A few whispered about surrender. Cathvoran silenced them all. He had burned Meridian 7 without mercy, and he knew the humans would show him the same courtesy. There would be no surrender, and there would be no peace. There would only be war until one side or the other was destroyed. But as the months passed and the losses mounted, he began to wonder if perhaps he had made a terrible mistake. He had poked a species he thought was weak and primitive. He had awakened something ancient and terrible, and now that something was coming for him. 1 year after the burning of Meridian 7, the human armada arrived at Velcanthos, and the Volante looked upon their doom. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the galaxy, and it filled the space around the Volante homeworld. Like a swarm of angry wasps, 4,000 warships had made the journey from human space. There were nimble destroyers that darted through the void like predators hunting prey. There were heavy cruisers, bristling with railguns and missile batteries. There were massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything the hegemony had ever built. Behind the combat vessels came the support fleet with carriers and repair ships and hospital ships and supply transports. It was a mobile civilization, and it had come to deliver judgment. But at the center of the formation hung something that made every Volante who saw it tremble with primal fear. The humans called it Nemesis. It was a weapon platform the size of a small moon. It had been built in secret over 30 years by workers who never knew the full scope of what they were creating. Its primary weapon was a particle accelerator that could crack the crust of a planet. Its secondary batteries could turn continents into glass. Its defensive shields could absorb the combined firepower of a dozen enemy fleets. Nemesis had been built for a war humanity hoped would never come. Now it hung in the sky above Velcanthos like the fist of an angry god. Admiral Chun Wayland stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Tian's Vengeance, and looked at the blue-green world on her view screen. Velcanthos was beautiful in its own alien way, with purple forests and silver oceans and cities that gleamed in the light of their star. 18 billion Volante lived on that world, and most of them had nothing to do with the decision to burn Meridian 7, but their leaders had given the order, and their fleets had carried it out, and their people had celebrated when word came of the successful cleansing. Chun remembered the footage of Elena Vasquez holding her infant daughter as the fire consumed them both. She remembered Governor Sarah Chun broadcasting pleas for her people to find shelter moments before her death. She remembered 2 million voices silenced in a single day. Her communications officer spoke, and his voice was uncertain. "Admiral, we are receiving a transmission from the planet's surface, and it appears to be from Admiral Cathvoran, and he is requesting to speak with you directly." Chun considered this for a long moment. Open a channel. The view screen flickered, and the face of Cathvoran appeared. He looked old and broken, and his purple chitin had faded to a dull gray, and his compound eyes held something Chun had never seen. In a Volante, before fear and absolute fear, Admiral Chen, he said through his translator, "I wish to discuss terms of surrender." Chum said nothing, and simply waited. Kethvoran continued, and his voice cracked with desperation. The hegemony will submit to whatever conditions you demand, and we will pay reparations, and we will disarm our fleets, and we will do anything you ask. He paused and seemed to struggle with his next words. Please, Admiral, there are billions of civilians on this world, and they are innocent, and they had no part in what I did, and I'm begging you not to destroy them for my sins. Chun let the silence stretch for a long moment. You speak of innocence, Admiral, but the children of Meridian 7 were innocent, and the families in those bunkers were innocent, and the mother holding her baby as your plasma fire burned them alive was innocent. Her voice was cold and hard. You gave no warnings, and you offered no mercy, and you murdered 2 million people because they built homes in a system you wanted. Kethvoran's head lowered in what might have been shame. I know what I did, and I know it cannot be undone, and I will accept whatever punishment you decree for myself. But please, do not make my people pay for my crimes. Chun looked at the alien who had caused so much suffering, and she felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her. She had the power to destroy his world and his species, and everything they had built over 12,000 years. Part of her wanted to do it. Part of her wanted to glass Volcanthos and watch 18 billion Galanti die the way 2 million humans had died on Meridian 7. It would be justice. It would be revenge. It would be what they deserved, but it would also make humanity no different from the monsters they were fighting. Chun thought of her grandmother, who had taught her that true strength was not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to know when destruction served no purpose. She thought of the human children who would grow up in a galaxy shaped by the choice she made in this moment. She thought of what humanity was supposed to be. This is Admiral Chun Wei-Lin of the United Terran Navy, she said, and her voice carried across every frequency. To all Volanthi military forces, you will stand down immediately, and you will surrender your vessels, and you will submit to occupation. She paused. But your civilians will not be harmed, and your cities will not burn, and your species will survive. Kethvoran looked up with disbelief in his alien eyes. The full might of humanity is not just our weapons, Admiral, and it is not just our rage, and it is not just our ability to destroy those who harm us. Chun's voice softened slightly. Our full might is our ability to choose mercy when destruction would be easier, and to build peace when war would be simpler, and to be better than those who wronged us. She looked at the world on her view screen. Meridian 7 will never be forgotten, and the dead will always be honored, and the hegemony will pay for what it did, but payment does not require genocide. She straightened in her chair. Surrender accepted, Admiral, and may your people learn from this day, and may they never forget what happens when they underestimate humanity. The channel closed, and across the bridge her crew sat in stunned silence. Some looked relieved, and some looked conflicted, and a few looked disappointed. Chun understood all of those feelings, because she felt them herself. Begin landing operations, she ordered, and signal Earth that the war is over and humanity has won. She turned back to the view screen and watched as Volanthi vessels began powering down their weapons and transmitting surrender codes. The galaxy would remember this day for 10,000 years. They would remember Meridian 7 and the 2 million who died. They would remember the war that followed and the terrible price the hegemony paid. They would remember that humanity came to Volcanthos with the power to destroy a civilization and chose to spare it instead. But most of all, they would remember the lesson that every species in the galaxy learned on this day. Do not mistake human kindness for weakness. Do not mistake human patience for cowardice. Do not mistake human mercy for inability to wage war, because when humanity is pushed too far, it will rise with all its fury and all its genius and all its terrible determination, and it will make its enemies wish they had never been born. But when the war is won, humanity will offer its hand instead of its fist, because that is what makes humanity strong. Not just the power to destroy, but the wisdom to build and the courage to forgive, even when forgiveness is the hardest thing of all.